Welcome inside the Dugout, powered by CubaDugout.com, your source for discovering Cuban baseball. Welcome inside the Dugout. I'm Phil Seelig. With me today is a gentleman I jokingly call the curator of the Cuban Hall of Fame. Joining us all the way from the UK, it is Gawain Owen. Gavin, thanks for joining us, and let's get straight to it. Tell people kind of your journey into Cuban baseball and why they should be interested in it.
Hey, Phil. Thank you very much for having me on the show today. So my journey with Cuban baseball really started in 2004. As a child growing up, traveled to America extensively, watched a lot of sport. I was like a sports kid junkie, loved baseball, but baseball wasn't really that popular in Europe. Come 2004, it was the Olympics. There was a pre-Olympic tournament in Italy. And as a family, we decided to go. And that is where I first met the Cuban baseball team. And I enjoyed collecting items. Like I used to go to the Arizona Fall League, used to get things signed by players. And the Cuban players, were so inviting. They were just such nice people. There was signed items. They wanted to communicate with you. And if you think back to the 2014, you had people like Pedro Lezu, a very young Gurriel on that team. Roberto Gonzalez, who's a good friend of yours, a fantastic lefty. And just the players at that time were just exceptional. But they had that kind of raw authenticity to them as well. From 2004, the Baseball World Cup was in Holland in 2006. Again, we went to the Baseball World Cup in 2006. And every year, typically a Cuban team comes to Europe to play in a tournament in Holland, in either Amsterdam or Rotterdam. And again, over the years, just got to know the players. But most importantly, I feel, and I think it's worth saying here, and I'm sure you experience it yourself, you need to be trusted by the Cuban Federation. Like the Federation needs to trust you to allow you in the hotel to potentially spend time in the players' rooms and ultimately build that relationship. And that is something that I'm very grateful for. And I'm sure that's something that you've worked on for many years, is building that trust and knowing that you're a safe pair of hands with the player and you're not going to put one of them in the back of a van and drive them over the border so they can sign for Major League Baseball.
Yeah, so as you know, it is a very complex situation, and that's why one of the things that I hope to do and hope to grow, and one of the coolest things is similar to your experience. Although you've actually had quite a great deal of up close access to the players, and we'll talk about that as well. But that exact scenario where they realize that your best interests or your interests are in growing the game and selling the game and putting a positive spin on baseball, both on the island and off the island. And, that's one of the growing sentiments that I try and share is the fact that the reach of Cuban players is so immense. But kind of back to the tournaments that you mentioned that might not be as well known, but provided some great opportunities, especially with the sheer amount of talent and some of those that are now, everyday household names. So maybe talk about some of the players that you mentioned a few, but some of the players that you've built those relationships with over the years, and maybe tie that into your collection. So as people can see behind you, and as I said, jokingly walking into it, I call you the curator of the Cuban Baseball Hall of Fame for the sake that you might have the most extensive collection of game-worn paraphernalia and all things Cuban. So maybe kind of delve us into that.
Absolutely. So I'm happy to talk about this, but then I think afterwards we should really talk about Peter Bjarkman, because Peter really was the founding father of Cuban baseball outside of Cuba. And Peter was someone that I always looked at as an inspiration, because if you think back in 2004 when I first got into this, YouTube was barely in existence. Mm-hmm. No one had actually launched Instagram at that point, and Twitter didn't exist. So it's actually really hard to build a relationship with these individuals. You could only do it primarily when they're off the island. So if I think about some of those stars that I've met over the time, the Gurriel brothers, Jose Abreu, Roberto Gonzalez, who if he had have made that difficult decision to leave, would have been an MLB star. Yadier Pedroso, who unfortunately lost his life when he came back to the island after the 2013 World Baseball Classic. Just thinking the Mesa brothers, Victor Mesa. People might say he's loco, but he's a true genius. He's a true gentleman. Roger Machado. Roger Machado is probably one of the cleverest people I've met in Cuba. There's no direct correlation between players leaving when Roger's on a trip but a lot of players left when Roger was on a trip. And I think Aroldis Chapman was a great example. People don't realize that, these players are kept under lock and key when they're on trips. For some reason, Chapman still had his passport 90 minutes after landing in Holland when he was in the team hotel. That was why he was able to leave and essentially cross the border into Spain. So I built a lot of trust with a lot of players over time, and it's primarily just doing what's right for them. If I said to you McDonald's or Burger King, they don't have those in Cuba. If I'm, in the evening I'm at the team hotel and I want to eat, I will ask anyone there, should we order pizza? Should we order McDonald's? And we order it because, unfortunately, they don't have that opportunity, Phil. So I've just built trust, and you've just built a great relationship with many players over the years by just being an authentic fan who had that unrivaled access.
Well, of course, there is one McDonald's on the island, but I don't think you want to eat there. So I'm glad that you mentioned Peter Bjarkman, who a lot of people in this sphere probably recognize, and maybe most recognize, from his appearance with Anthony Bourdain. He also wrote a couple books, and I'll link to those. They are kind of the prerequisite reading for the current Cuban experience, but also delves into the history. He has a number of books, but unfortunately he left us in 2018, and there's some big shoes to fill there. Peter actually references you in a couple of his books, and so you clearly were at the forefront there, and you mentioned a couple of the players that left. That must have been a fairly interesting experience to be with them and to kind of, as you say, kind of see. I always say Cuba's like a duck. And, everything seems very calm above the water, but underneath the feet are going like crazy. And those scenarios, when you were touring with the team and some of the things you must have seen, how interesting was it to see those players then appear in the majors not long after that?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, every single trip became slightly more crazy. 2004, it was very controlled. The internet didn't really exist. Peter was there. Peter had unrivaled access. He was allowed to travel Cuba freely. As an American, to travel Cuba freely, those two words don't go hand in hand. The gentleman wrote over 3 dozen books, not just on baseball, across other sports as well. So he has an authoritative voice. 2004, it was very controlled. 2006, Baseball World Cup. It was still controlled. The players were established players, possibly too old to go into Major League Baseball. And I don't like to use the word defection, but it was starting to become a word, And then when we get to kind of 2011, 2013, unfortunately, and Peter quotes me that in his books, the trips to Holland weren't to play baseball, they were shopping trips. It was primarily, what am I bringing off the island? Cigars. What can I sell? How much money can I make? And how many pairs of Nike trainers can I take back to Cuba for my family or for my friends? And, in those tournaments, they actually had shipping containers. The tournament had to agree to shipping containers for the items to be sent back to Cuba. And at that point, that kind of authenticity of why are we at the tournament? And to touch on what you're saying, Phil, unfortunately, I remember in 2012 in Harlem, there was a well-known middleman in the hotel, and Diaz, now with the Houston Astros, left during that tournament. 2013, an American was in the hotel because a player had said that he would defect. That player decided not to defect on that trip, but left several months later. On that trip, someone was there to see Yoan Moncada. Moncada left legally. Moncada went to the federation and said, to Mr. Velez, who's not an easy man to do business with, I don't want to play anymore. And he was able to legally leave. But what I will say is, from 2004 up to 2017, it became more of a non-baseball event every single time they left the island.
Excellent. So now that's obviously some great insight, and you paint an interesting picture as well of what potentially life is like on the island for the players. So you've seen, the numbers show it, but you saw a kind of a palpable change in the approach where, like you said, defection is a bad word, but increasingly the number of players that at one time the apex for them was playing in the Cuban National Series and playing for the Cuban national team, that now with so many people before them that have found success in the majors, that seems to be the new objective? Or how would you define the current kind of motivation for the average Cuban player that A, maybe is a potential major league prospect, but B, for those that aren't, if you can kind of delve into that?
So I think the changes in the international signing bonus had a significant change. So I think you had, some of those kind of classic players, someone like a Leslie Anderson who played in the 2006 Baseball World Classic. A number of those players, Yuli Meyer, they decided to leave and they had moderate success in America. We then came up to, 2009 Chapman. Chapman left, managed to get a passport out of Andorra. He was an instant success. We then have Yasiel Puig, who really had no choice to leave the island. He wasn't allowed to play. Was on his trip to Holland. He didn't realize that in the shops he actually had to pay for stuff. He thought that shoplifting was perfectly acceptable. Peter did a great job again with the right people to kind of, smooth that over. But that's one of the reasons why he wasn't able to play on the island. At that point, players were leaving like him, Cespedes, well known. He had to leave the island. Those players were signing for big money. So that all of a sudden, putting the money to one side, they were having success. Those players were having success in Major League Baseball. And the players they played with on the island were all of a sudden thinking, actually, I want to raise my game. I want to play Major League Baseball. The biggest challenge on the island today, Phil, and I'm sure you see it when you're there, is pitching. How many pitchers can throw over 85 miles an hour? We're not talking 90, which is kind of MLB standard. So the biggest challenge now is the younger batters on the island. When they go to the international tournaments, they get blown away by 90, 95 mile an hour fastballs because they just haven't seen them. They don't see, decent curveballs. So what is really interesting now, Phil, is this new era where players are going to Japan. And that in itself is becoming really interesting due to the international signing bonus. So not only have you got the young Cubans who are now essentially showcasing themselves in Japan, the opportunity to earn some money. Just recently, agents now are placing young Dominican players in Japan to showcase them over 2 to 3 years, to potentially then bring them over to Major League Baseball and be able to sign for signing bonuses that they would have been able to achieve 3 or 4 years back.
Yeah, no, and I touched on a level of that in the writing, and I think that the agreement with Japan represents a wonderful opportunity for, in some circumstances, players that might grade out as quadruple A players to go and play at what is still a great level of baseball, but to be able to make what is life-altering money, yes, less than they would make in MLB, and to be able to bring that back to Cuba, to their community, and surprisingly pay less to the Cuban Federation than I would have expected. So yeah, I'm intrigued to see that, and we're seeing an increasing number of players there and in leagues all around the world. Also to touch on, I like to say there's 3 things that the Cubans really have to adjust to when they come over to America or the majors, and it's fast balls, fast cars, and fast women. So those 3 things are kind of the biggest adjustment for them. So now you touch on some very interesting things there, and let's delve into a little bit more of, we can see in the background there, obviously just a small selection of kind of the jerseys and the different items that you have. Talk about your passion for collecting, and maybe key on a couple of your favorite pieces that you've acquired over the years. Yeah,
so I've always collected, as I said, I collected, baseball cards, etc. when I was a lot younger. And again, I saw at tournaments, Peter would always buy the jerseys, and it almost became, in later years with Peter, almost a bit of a competition when we were at the same tournament. Who's going to buy what jerseys? And I buy jerseys based on the players. So players that I would say I have a good friendship with, players that I spend time with in the tournament, and ultimately players who mean something to me. So when I think about players still on the island, Frank Mahon, a great friend of yours as well. Any industrialist fan knows who Frank is. Unfortunately these days, Frank, he has to have a first aider walk behind him the whole time because he's always getting hurt. But when he's in a game, he controls that pitching staff. So love collecting items from Frank. Norberto Gonzalez, one of the greatest lefties of all time in Cuba, a real entrepreneur. The guy not only was a great pitcher, he understood that when he was overseas, he had to look after his family. He legally took himself out of Cuba to play in Italy. He organized that himself, and he played in the Tuno for 2 years, and I saw him in Italy. Ismael Jimenez, another great pitcher who played in the Classic with Sanchi Spiritus, is now their pitching coach. Again, a very nice player. I spent time with him in Quebec. Probably the family I collect the most is the Gurriel family, and that is primarily Yuli. So when I first met Yuli in 2004, he was known as a talent because of his father. But he was a very humble young man, a very shy person, and still today Yuli is incredibly shy. And over time, I spent a lot of time with Yuli at tournaments, spent time in the hotel with him, eating pizza, eating fast food, as you said, Phil, and just got a real admiration for what he stood for. And what he stood for was being a family person. Family comes first. Always want to test yourself in Major League Baseball, but family came first. And he believed in the opportunity that the Cuban government were going to open the opportunity to play in Major League Baseball. But there became that point where, unfortunately, they had no choice. Now, what was funny was I don't think Yuli and Juanito had actually left the hotel when players were messaging me saying, the Gurriel brothers have left, but I've got all their equipment. I've gone in their room, I've got their bats, I've got their jerseys, I've got their kit bags. What exactly do you want? And for them, that then became a commercial opportunity because they knew that I collect. So at the same time as collecting, Phil, I am obviously paying for the stuff, and that then allows the players to, use that money for whatever they need to use it for.
Oh, it's obviously we kind of connected through that, and it's not an easy hobby to have, and I've been glad to kind of help out where I can to bring some of the items back and send them and kind of test that. One of the things that I really enjoy over the years is the talent of these players, but how humble they are. And that we have become friends because there is some of it is in helping them out, but others is in even in the broken Spanish, limited Spanish that I speak and the limited English that we do connect over baseball. And a lot of the guys, as you say, are very mild mannered, very, very humble. And even back to Yuli Gurriel, I would say expresses himself with his bat and with his hairstyle. So, would you say that players kind of fall into two camps? Because there is an impression of a lot of Cuban players of being flashy, of being over the top. But as you mentioned, and a number of the people that I have, there seems to be a split between that very colorful player and the very reserved, very, very shy player.
I think that's a great point. I think what's also worth pointing out, people don't realize how much the players in Major League Baseball are doing for the players on the island today. One of the biggest challenges, Bill, you and I have spoken around the opportunity to even have decent bats.
Yeah.
In the Cuban League. You would be amazed how many Yoan Moncada, how many Abreu bats, how many Leonis Martin bats, how many Yuli Gurriel bats, Vladimir Guerrero bats even, are actually being used in the Cuban League. The players send an immense amount of equipment back to Cuba. Moncada and Abreu now spend their off-season living back in Cuba primarily. So I think, when you look at this, players recognize where they've come from. They realize their humble upbringings, and they've been successful, but they've been successful as Major League Baseball players, but they don't forget where they came from. And I think a great example of that was Jose Abreu, where he went back to the island, I think it was 2-3 years back on that Major League tour. I think the Pope had less people turn up to see him. He was held in that level of admiration because of everything that he did, and people remember them for exactly what they did. And they are still, as you said, very, very normal people. Even people like Aroldis Chapman, everyone can follow him on Instagram, everyone can follow him on social media. But at the end of the day, yes, he has a slightly crazy lifestyle, but remember where he came from. He came from Holguin. He went to he had a basic upbringing. He probably had like a one-bedroom kind of hut he lived in. If you had that kind of money now, I'm sure, Phil, you would go and buy yourself a nice car.
Yeah, so it's interesting as well. You mentioned Abreu, and so yeah, when he was on the tour to Havana back in, might have actually been 2015, 2016, but
Yeah.
Anecdotally, I bumped into him during my trip in 2019 in 5th of September Stadium. And so it was interesting. So he probably wasn't expecting the one kind of gringo there that might be able to get and put the message out to approach him. But he was very, very gracious about the fact that I kind of asked for photos, like, no, I don't want any pressure there. But also I can confirm he's still Cuban, because he hit me with the three words that every Cuban knows: where are you from? So he hasn't lost his roots. That's good. It's very interesting. Like you say, that the connections there. That's another theme that I like to key on, because there are a number of people that think that once they're gone, that's it. They don't want anything to do. And I mean, everybody has their own opinions. There have been some players that are outspoken that they will never return until there is change. But a lot of players would love to see a scenario where either they can return more often, more players are returning more often in a way that they can help. What do you think the future of baseball on the island is? What sort of changes do you think, and what do you think is a best case scenario to keep baseball vibrant on the island, but for players to also get the opportunity to excel at the highest level possible for them?
Yeah, so I think the 2017 World Baseball Classic and the tournaments since then have really shown that the talent on the island, if we're being brutally honest, the talent just isn't there anymore. Players are leaving at an alarming rate, young players. And this becomes a challenge because the island is known as one of the greatest powerhouses in baseball of all time, but it can't even make, it's in the Olympic qualifying tournament, it didn't make the Olympics direct for this year. This becomes like a real kind of like crescendo, in my opinion. I see in the future, and it's just my own personal viewpoint, that it has to open up to some point. The team will not perform in the Classic. The team will not perform in the Olympics because of the talent that is unfortunately on the island today. So I see some kind of winter league, and it kind of, plays quite nicely with the MLB season. The opportunity for players to go back, but also some kind of system that's already in place for the Dominican players and for the Latino players with the international signing bonuses. So that's what I see in the future. I do see an opportunity. Maybe with the next World Baseball Classic could be too soon, but hopefully it's not, an opportunity. And I think, Bill, we've already seen that, Leslie Anderson, Aroldis, they've gone back to play in the league. Like they've gone back through their reclassification. Like they are still living in the US, but they're allowed to go back and play in the Cuban Baseball League, and that's been successful. And I think that's the first stepping stone.
Perfect. So you still follow the game on the island to this day?
I'll be honest. It's probably easier than ever to follow it because because the internet now is at a point. But I struggle with that connection. So many players that I've seen play over the years have left the island. If I'm watching a game, it's primarily to watch certain players. And it's becoming a real struggle for me now. I love my Cuban baseball. I absolutely love following them, and I will continue to follow them. But it's real hard to build up that kind of emotional attachment. And I think that's what's different between myself. I love the baseball for the players and getting to know the players. If I think about Major League Baseball, I turn up at a stadium, there's 50,000 of us. You're kind of looking at a player through this kind of glass wall, like you don't even know anything about them. And what I had for so many years was that kind of emotional attachment towards certain players. So now, when I go to the US, I will plan my schedules around Major League games with certain players. Excellent. And those players still know me, they'll still talk to me, we still connect. So I kind of almost see a transition for myself from baseball on the island to baseball off the island. But I still do talk to a lot of the players, Moncada, Cepeda, Ismael Jimenez, Roberto Gonzalez, a lot of those players that, I absolutely love spending time with.
Perfect. So no, that's great to hear, and there's been a lot of great information here. Just one final question for you: when are you going to start giving tours of the Cuban Baseball Hall of Fame, which you currently have in your home?
Well, I think that's funny because I still think that Peter's, Peter's obviously passed on, but Peter's collection in my eyes, is still far better than my collection. Like when you look on his website and you look at the jerseys he's got, you've got the stuff that Peter's got. For me, that is the Cuban Baseball Hall of Fame. Now, from my perspective, I think I need to build a new wing. So I've actually outgrown, where I've acquired and where you've helped me, where I've acquired so much stuff. It's a real challenge. Like there's no more room. But I think, as I said, I'm at this point now where I've got everything I probably wanted, and I'm in this transition from Cuban baseball to now enjoying the players for the next 3 or 4 years during their major league career.
Perfect. And if people want to follow along, because you do post a lot of the items that you have there, especially as you acquire them, where can they find you?
Yeah, Instagram, I'm sure you're going to put a tag up there, Cuba Baseball. Always reach out with questions and just love talking about baseball. Thank you.
Perfect. Excellent. Thanks for joining us today. And like I said, go check them.
Just before we go,
Yep.
I think it would be completely wrong, and I can't believe we've been talking for 15 minutes and we haven't plugged Yusuf Diaz and Giordano's book.
Well, so obviously I interviewed Yusuf just this week, and hoping in the future can get back down to Florida and spend some time and hopefully help them with some projects. But yeah, absolutely. You've got your copy. What are your early returns on their brand new book?
Those two guys have passion for the game. They might have Spanglish as their kind of language, but all in all, the books are great. And again, it speaks to taking over from Peter's legacy in some ways. Is they're connecting with the players, doing the interviews. But like I say, I think this is probably the first interview in the last 3-4 weeks where it's taken us so long for someone to talk about Yusuf's book. So anyone who enjoys this game, please go onto Amazon and have a copy.
Perfect. And check out the recent interview I did with Yusuf, and I'll actually be dropping more pieces of that as time goes on, right here on YouTube. So just like to say thanks for joining us today, and we'll definitely keep in touch and keep collecting. We'll keep sharing those stories. So
thank you.
As always, subscribe here on YouTube, smash the like button like a hanging slider, or share this video.